My mother was a prostitute. My father was a pimp. I bet I got your attention now. I'm half black and half white. My mother's Irish, from Worcester, Massachusetts. My father was an African-American male from down south, Montgomery, Alabama. My father was 24 years old when he met my mother. My mother was 19. Together, they would go on to live a very reckless and ruthless life together. Both my mother and father were alcoholics and drug addicts. My father was a very abusive man, and he spent the majority of my childhood going in and out of prisons. I remember one time specifically, he was beating my mother. We were in our bedroom, myself at the age of 8, my older brother who was at the age of 10, and my younger brother who was at the age of 2. And I remember hearing the noise and my mother screaming at the top of her lungs, but the neighbors wouldn't do nothing because they were racist. They would say things to my mother like, "You nigger lover." This was back in the 80s when it wasn't cool for a black person to be with a white person. And I remember hearing my mother scream at the top of her lungs and furniture being thrown around and all the beats and slaps, and you could hear it all coming right through the door. We were in our bedroom with the door closed. And I remember my younger brother, I was about 8, he was about 2. And he jumped out of the bed and he ran to the door as if he wanted to open the door up, but he knew better. At the age of 2, he knew he shouldn't open that door. And he ran to that door. He ran to that door and he stood in front of it and he stood on his tippy toes and he clenched his whole body tight like this and he screamed at the top of his lungs. And I remember being scared and I jumped out of the bed and I put my hand around his mouth and I covered his mouth because I didn't want my father to hear that noise. I didn't want my father to hear him screaming because maybe my father might come in there and start beating on us. Yeah, my father would be high on drugs. He was very abusive to my mother and to myself and to my siblings. And I remember the next morning when I woke up, it seemed like something that wasn't real. It seemed like something that wasn't real at all. As I opened the door for the bedroom the next morning, it looked like something, there was a murder scene in a movie. Blood everywhere. Blood on the floor and blood on the kitchen table and blood on the walls and blood on the kitchen cabinets. And I remember being 8 years old and wondering to myself if my mother was even alive or not. Because at that point, we didn't see her. Finally, when we did get to see my mother didn't even look human. Her face was beat up and swelled up and black and blue and fat and blood everywhere. And I remember my father. I was 8 years old, and my older brother was 10 years old. And I remember my father made me and my older brother get on our hands and knees and clean up our own mother's blood. My father was a very abusive man when he was high on drugs and alcohol. I remember one time specifically, I was 12 years old, and my father had found out that me and my older brother was fighting, and that I tried to stab my older brother. At this time, I'm 12, and my older brother was 14. And so my father said, "Yeah, I have something for you." So he took me outside. He picked up a big piece of wood, and he said, "I'm gonna beat you, son, but for this specific beating, he had rules. And the rules were, I would have put my hands on the bumper of the car. And so I put my hands on the bumper of the car. And the rules were that if I took my hands off the bumper of the car, my beating would start all over again." And so I remember, 12 years old, I wrapped my hands around that bumper. My father lifted up the piece of wood and he brought it down across my back. Whack! Immediately, my hands came off of the bumper and I screamed in pain. And my father looked at me and he said, "Son, don't let this keep happening." So again, I wrapped my hands around that bumper. My father reached back with the wood, came across my back again, crack. But I held the bumper this time. And he did it again, crack. And I held the bumper. And he did it again, crack, crack. And he kept hitting me. But I held on to that bumper. And I didn't let go of the bumper. And at one point, a woman came out the building. She came out the building. It was a black woman, I remember. And she was standing up on her porch. And she said, "You better leave that boy alone." She said, "I'm going to call the cops on you. You better leave that boy alone." And my father just continued to beat me. And beat me. And beat me. But I tell you, I didn't let go of that bumper. And when my father was finished, my body was beat up. My flesh was soft and torn from my back up here below down to behind my knees. The flesh was welted up, scraped up, bleeding. And my father took me and he said, now sit in the car. And he made me sit down. He made me sit on what he had just done to me. He made me sit on it. And at a certain point, my father said, come here, I want you to get out the car. Now, at this point, I thought, maybe he was going to apologize. You know what I'm saying? Maybe he was going to say he was sorry for beating me so bad. You know what I'm saying? Because my dad would do that sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes he would tell me, that famous line that a lot of us heard, that beating hurt me more than it hurt you. But nah, this is not what he had. This is not what he had in store for me. This is not what he had to say to me. He looked me in my face and he said, son, I want you to know something. He said, I want you to know that I didn't stop beating you because that woman told me to stop beating you. I stopped beating you because the stick broke. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and share with someone who you think may either be able to relate to the video and or get something out of it. Click the link to the right for the full video. Stay blessed and remember, no excuses.